In today's video, you'll be guided step by step through the process of creating two stunning styles of cutting boards. Whether using basic tools or more advanced ones, these practical techniques are designed for anyone to follow. Every new woodworker at some point decides to build a cutting board. They're relatively easy to build and they're extremely useful. Plus, they sell really well. That's why a lot of people get into making them. The first cutting board that we're going to be building together is actually a store-bought kit from Woodcraft, which means this is a great option for those that don't own a lot of tools yet. This particular cutting board is made from brown heart, marble wood, purple heart, hard maple, and wenge, and it measures 16 inches by 10 inches. The second board will be made from store-bought S4S lumber, which stands for surfaced on all four sides, which means that most of the milling process has already been done for you, and all you need is a table saw, track saw, or a circular saw to cut the pieces down to size. This board measures 16 inches by 22 inches and is made from 8/4 thick hard maple. Starting with the store-bought kit, lay the individual boards out over your clamps. I'm using parallel clamps, but you could also use pipe clamps or even F-style clamps. If you're not familiar with woodworking clamps, I'll leave a link below to a beginner video which explains the different styles of clamps. With all cutting boards, I recommend using Titebond 3 because of its water resistance and because it has a longer working time compared to other versions. This can get very messy, so I use a roll of paper on top of my bench to protect it, as well as cover the bars of my clamps with painter's tape. This is a time where you don't need to be bashful with the glue. Make sure every surface is covered. I'm using a silicone brush to help me spread the glue out evenly, and yes, you only need to add glue to one side of the mating surfaces. Titebond 3's directions on the bottle recommend clamping for a minimum of 30 minutes and not stressing the joint for 24 hours. I always give mine more time in the clamps, at least 2 hours, but that depends on current shop conditions. When in doubt, let it dry for 24 hours before stressing the joint. The most important part about the glue up is to make sure that the boards are tight to the bottom of the clamp and that each individual piece is flush with the one next to it. However, sometimes things can't be perfect, and that's okay. But take the extra time now because it really does help to reduce the amount of sanding you will have to do later on. While this board dries, let's start ripping down the hard maple for the next cutting board. If you like my style of teaching and you're looking to learn even more about routers, then my new beginners online routers course is now available. This course provides over 3 hours of video lessons, downloadable documents, buying guides, full access to me, and much more. If you're interested, follow the links below to start learning and mastering skills that you'll be able to use the rest of your creative life. If you remember, this cutting board is 16 inches by 22. So I'm starting with 3 pieces of S4S measuring 22.5 inches long by 6 inches wide by 1 13/16 inches thick, which is the actual finished thickness of 8/4 S4S here in the United States. Now, more traditional cutting boards use 1.5 inch thick material. I can only get a hold of 2-inch thick material, so I don't think it really makes that big of a difference. It just changes the appearance slightly. Here I'm using a thin kerf 24 tooth ripping blade in my table saw to rip down these larger boards into 1.5 inch strips. Keep in mind, whatever width you rip these down to, that will be the total thickness of your cutting board. For this size board, we will need a total of 9 pieces to get a width of just over 16 inches. To recap, here are the 9 pieces laid out. Each of them is ripped to 1.5 inches. And if you remember, they are 1 13/16 inches thick. But that is not the thickness of the cutting board. Why? Because we need to turn these so that the edge grain is up, which then makes our total cutting board thickness 1.5 inches. Now, because I'm using a planer to help flatten these boards, I'm going to do this glue up in 2 sections, one with 6 pieces and one with 3 pieces. I'm doing this because the width of my planer is only 13 inches. So if I glue up the whole board, it won't fit through my planer. However, if you don't have a planer and you're going to be hand sanding this, I would go ahead and glue all 9 pieces together now. And don't worry, I'm going to demonstrate with the first board how to hand sand for those that don't own a planer. To glue these up in 2 parts, you can use one set of clamps, but just simply leave out the glue between the 6th and 7th piece. That way, when you unclamp everything, you will have 2 separate parts. While the glue dries on these, let's jump back to the first board and start sanding. Once the board comes out of the clamps, you can see that the Type On 3 dries a little dark, which means that you may be able to detect a small dark line on lighter woods, like our maple cutting board, for example. However, this has never bothered me because I'm really not trying to make the seams completely disappear. You can explore other glue options as well, including using Type On 2, which is a lighter color. However, you will not get the same water protection with the 2 as you do with the 3. This is just something I wanted to bring to your attention because for some people, this really makes a difference. Diving back in, the first thing I like to do is to use a paint scraper or something similar to remove any large bits of glue. Now, depending on how well you did with your glue up, you may be able to get away with using just a random orbital sander. However, sometimes it can be very helpful to use a belt sander first because it does remove a lot of material much faster. And if you're not familiar with how to use a belt sander or an orbital sander, I have attached to this lesson beginner videos to help you with each one. Whichever tool you use, it's important to keep in mind the proper sanding progressions, which are as follows. Now, where you start in the sanding progression just depends on how uneven or scratched the wood is. And what grit you stop at depends on the finish you'll be using or how much of a sheen you are looking for in that finish. With higher quality sandpaper, most people would agree that you can skip a grit. For example, if you start at 60 and you want to end at 220, you could do 60, 100, 150, and 220. I personally generally don't like to skip a grit, but if I have to start at a really low grit because the project is in really bad shape, I will. In addition, if you buy store-bought surfaced wood, you should be able to start with 120 and work your way up from there. Also, if you have a helical cutter on your jointer or planer, you should be able to start with 150 and work your way up. And because we're using an oil finish for both boards, I recommend stopping at 180 grit. However, if you like a glossier look or you'd be using a different type of finish, you will want to go higher. It's time to cut the board to length. I'm using a miter saw, but you can use a table saw to do this as well. But if you don't have either one of those, you can use a straight edge clamp and a circular saw. Now that the board is flat and square, it's time to cut in some juice grooves. Juice grooves, for those that don't know, are grooves that keep any liquid from running off the edge of the board. Juice grooves can be done many different ways, but let me show you what I think is the easiest and most flexible way to do it. The bit we'll be using is the same round nose bit we practiced with back in Chapter 3. The first thing to determine is how far from the edge of the cutting board you want the groove to be. I would say the range is somewhere between 1/2 inch and 1 inch in from the edge. To help you visualize what this may look like on your board, you can hold the bit up to the edge and move it in or out to see what looks good to you. You could also use one of the practice pieces from Chapter 3, to hold it up to your board to see what looks good. Once you have determined its location, measure from the edge of the board to the edge of your router base, like this. Be sure that you're measuring from the round part of your base. Here I have 2 3/8. Armed with that number, use a saw to cut 2 3/8 wide strips of 3/4 inch solid wood or plywood. You will need 4 at 18 inches long and 4 at 24 inches long. This material will become the guides you will use to make the juice grooves. Keep in mind that if you're using a different router than I am, or you choose to put the groove in a little bit further, a little bit closer, just know that that 2 3/8 is going to be slightly different for your board. The guides get assembled like this, with this piece butting up against this one. This piece creates the correct distance away from the cutting board, while this piece provides a stop or a guide for the router base to follow. To assemble them, add some glue and some screws, and it's that simple. The last piece to make this whole jig work is a piece of solid plywood that goes under both the board and your newly made guides. With that down, place the cutting board in the middle, then start placing the guides around the board, starting at one side and installing them around in a circle. As you can see, these are somewhat long for this board, but that's because by making them longer, you're able to use them on larger boards as well, making these guides more universal. Now all you have to do is screw the guides down to the plywood below, making sure that they are tight to the cutting board. It's also a good idea to clamp the whole unit down so it doesn't slide on your bench. With the jig all set up, install the round nose bit and set the depth of cut to what you want it to be. I'm setting my depth at around 3/16 from the 0 point of the router bit. I will also be doing a cleanup pass, maybe 2, at a very shallow depth, so by the time it's all said and done, my groove will be at around 1/4 inch deep. I also want to say that because we are routing in the middle of a board and using a router bit that doesn't have a guide bearing, routing direction is going to be up to you as the creator. I'm going to choose a clockwise direction because it seems to help hold the router tighter to the guide. You may also have noticed that I didn't start in a corner. Severe router burn or other mistakes can happen if you do. It's really important to keep the base held tight to the board at all times. The tendency is that once your base overhangs the board, it tends to want to tip slightly, and if that does, it will throw off your straight line. If something is going to go wrong, 9 times out of 10 it will be in the corners. However, cleanup passes and some sanding can fix a lot, so don't panic if something happens. The last thing I want to mention is that you can do this cut in multiple passes, and I probably suggest doing it that way. Or you could be crazy like me and take off the whole 3/16 in one pass. With my 3/16 pass now done, I'll raise my micro adjustment up here, which I didn't cover earlier in this course. With one complete revolution counterclockwise, the depth rod will raise a 32nd of an inch, which allows the router bit to travel further down, cleaning up any burn marks. And if one pass doesn't do it, simply adjust the depth rod again and make another pass. With that done, remove the guides and use a 1/4 inch radius round over bit to ease both the top and the bottom edges of the board. Lastly, before you put the finish on, get the juice grooves, the ends, and the newly rounded edges caught up to the grit you stopped at on the top. For me, that was 150 grit, so I'll do all those areas to get them caught up, do my water pop, let it dry, and then finish with a 180 grit. All right, this board is ready for finish, but before we do that, let's jump back to the other board to get it caught up to where this one is. With the 2 units removed from the clamps, clean them up as before, but this time run them through the planer one side and then flip them over and run it through on the other. And as you can see, this makes really quick work of flattening the boards. From there, it's right back to gluing them up again and sticking them back in the clamps to cook. This time, however, I'm going to remove the glue before it completely hardens. This is also a great way to do it. Once you've given them enough time to dry, it's back out of the clamps and the sanding process begins. Because my planer produces such a smooth finish, I can jump right into 150 to flatten out that one seam we had to glue together. Then it's time to square up each end. I'm using a table saw sled for this one because of its size, but a circular saw and a straight edge would work as well. We're not going to do Jew screws on this board, but let's put in some finger slots. Finger slots are just as they sound, places where you can get your fingers in to be able to lift the cutting board off the counter. To make these 2 finger slots, we're going to be using the same round nose bit, but this time set the router up with an edge guide. In order to route on a narrow edge, adding some extra material like this to the workpiece really helps give the router base something more to sit on. After you've clamped on whatever scrap material you want and you've double checked that the board is secure, draw a center line on the board to begin the layout. Let's make the total length of the slot 5 inches. So that means 2.5 inches to the right and 2.5 inches to the left of center line. The last thing to check before routing is to make sure that you are center this way on the board. To do that, draw a center line and use the fine adjustment dial on the edge guide to line up the bit. The depth setting I'm using is the same for the Jew screws, and I'll do that all in one pass. Again, adding a very shallow cleanup pass to finish everything out. Now keep in mind that as you change the depth of your cut, you may notice that you are slightly shorter or slightly beyond your layout lines. Now if you want to land your layout perfectly at your specific depth, I recommend that you do it on a scrap piece first, get everything dialed in before you go ahead and commit to doing it on the board. The last milling to do is to ease the edges with that same 1/4 inch round over. Just make sure that your guide bearing that's on your round over has complete bearing all the way around the board. Remember, we did cut slots in the ends of the board. Finish with some more sanding as before, catching everything up like the end grain and finger slots to 150, do a water pop, and then finish with the 180. There are many different ways that you can finish off your cutting board. The most basic version is to use 100% mineral oil, food grade mineral oil, and some wood wax. In this lesson though, I'm going to show you 2 different products that I'm going to use and that I have been using. The first one is Booze Block. There's an oil and actually a cream. They come together as a kit. And the next one is Odie's oil, and it looks like this. It is an all-in-one product, and it can be used on many different types of woodworking projects, not only just cutting boards, and it can be used on other materials as well. I'd like to start by giving the board a quick vac to remove any remaining dust. I've also pulled back out the bench cookies from chapter 3, but this time I've added their caps for finishing. The main idea with the booze oil is to really soak the board with it. Don't be bashful. This is by far the best part about building a cutting board. It's watching it come to life right before your eyes. Take your time, adding more if you need to, and just enjoy the process. Once you have covered it really well, let it sit overnight so that the board can continue to absorb the oil. The next day, remove any excess oil with a clean towel and then apply the cream, which too needs to sit overnight. The next day, polish off any excess material in this board is ready to be put to good use. Now, depending on the amount of use you put your cutting board through, you may want to repeat this process every single month. Now, moving on to Odie's. Odie's oil gets applied very, very differently. And the key to this product is not applying too much. On most woods, you'll get around 25 square feet per ounce of product. So this whole bottle, you're looking to get about 250 square feet worth of coverage. For this board, which is under 6 square feet, you will need less than 1/4 of an ounce of oil after the pad has already been saturated. The oil needs stirred before use, going until it liquefies, about like this. And to apply, it's best done with a non-woven pad and worked into the surface of the wood in circular motions. Remember, this product goes a long way, so do not over-apply. Once you have worked it all in, let it sit for about an hour and then use a cotton towel to buff it off, making sure to buff in the direction of the grain and flipping the towel around to a clean area often. With that, the only thing left to do with these boards is to use them. Well, today's video is actually a small segment of my full 3-hour online routers course. So if you find yourself a little bit overwhelmed by today's project and you feel like you need to learn more, then my routers course might be ideal for you. All you got to do to figure out if this course is a good fit is to click the link down in the notes section and in the pinned comment, and that'll take you over to my website. For those of you that decided to make it to the end of the video, I'm offering you a 50% discount. All you have to do is email me and let me know you made it to the end of this video, and I'll send you a discount code so you can get 50% off that course to get you started. Of course, if you ever have any questions about woodworking and carpentry, please hit me up. And if I can pray for you in any way, shape, or form, please let me know that as well. Bye for now.